The day Brenda Kilpatrick torched my great-grandfather's corn barn, she had no idea she was about to face federal judge Thaddeus Brennan, the man who sent the entire Riverside County Commission to prison for 23 years combined. I'm standing here at 5:47 a.m., my boots grinding against charred timber and twisted metal that still radiates heat. That choking cocktail of burned oak, century-old corn dust, and diesel fuel coats your mouth like ash. Brenda thought she was eliminating an eyesore that hurt her property values. What she actually did was hand me a federal case so airtight it would destroy not just her, but the entire corruption network she'd been feeding for years. This smiling HOA president made one catastrophic error. She Googled retired judge and figured I was some harmless old man who'd roll over. She never bothered checking my specialty, dismantling corrupt officials who abuse power for profit. What would you do if your HOA president burned down the barn your great-grandfather built with his Purple Heart hands? Tell me where you're watching from, because I guarantee half of you have a Brenda terrorizing your neighborhood right now. My name is Thaddeus Brennan, and 3 years ago I thought I was done sending people to prison. 27 years on the federal bench teaches you to spot corruption from a mile away. But after watching my wife Margaret lose her battle with cancer, I figured it was time to find peace on the 47 acres my grandfather Seamus left me in Millfield County, Iowa. Seamus Brennan arrived from County Cork in 1948 with nothing but Purple Heart shrapnel in his leg and hands that knew how to build things that lasted forever. That corn barn went up in 1952. Every beam hand-cut from Iowa oak, every joint fitted so tight you couldn't slide a dime between them. 70 years later, those weathered walls still held the sweet smell of dried corn and the ghost of his pipe tobacco, mixed with that particular scent of old wood that survived decades of brutal Iowa winters. I moved here thinking retirement meant restoring tractors, growing corn, and enjoying the kind of bone-deep silence you only get when your nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile away. What I didn't expect was that quarter-mile to be packed with 847 identical McMansions called Millfield Estates, all controlled by a woman who could teach Machiavelli lessons in ruthless power. Brenda Kilpatrick didn't just run the Millfield Estates HOA. She owned it like her personal kingdom. Picture 5'6" of razor-sharp authority wrapped in designer suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary, always clutching a clipboard like it contained state secrets. Her pristine white Mercedes matched her bleached smile, and when those stiletto heels hit pavement, they clicked out a rhythm that sounded exactly like a countdown timer. Tick, tick, tick. The woman had weaponized suburban conformity. Brenda sold real estate for a living, peddling these cookie-cutter homes to young families who never bothered reading the fine print about what their HOA could control. Her husband Randy ran the county's biggest construction company, which meant between them, they had more influence over local building permits than the actual county commissioners. It was like watching a medieval monarchy, except instead of a castle, they ruled from a strip mall office decorated with motivational posters about community standards. Here's the beautiful irony. My property sat smack in the middle of their kingdom but completely outside their control. Seamus had been smart enough to lock down agricultural exemptions and mineral rights in the county records back when HOAs were just a gleam in some developer's eye. Legally speaking, Brenda had as much authority over my land as she did over the International Space Station, but apparently, nobody had bothered explaining property law to the self-appointed Empress of Suburbia. Her first royal visit came on a crisp September morning while I was coaxing my grandfather's John Deere back to life. The throaty rumble of that old diesel always brought back memories of Seamus teaching me to drive when I was 12, his calloused hands guiding mine on the steering wheel. I was elbow deep in the carburetor, breathing in that familiar cocktail of motor oil and morning dew when those heels started machine gunning up my gravel driveway like incoming mortar rounds. "Mr. Brennan?" Her voice had that particular real estate agent quality, honey poured over razor wire. "I'm Brenda Kilpatrick, HOA president. We need to discuss your agricultural structures." She stood there in her cream business suit, staring at my freshly painted red barn like it was personally insulting her bloodline. The morning sun made those walls glow like something out of American Gothic, which they were, really. A piece of genuine Americana that had been feeding families since Harry Truman was president. "Ma'am," I said, wiping diesel fuel off my hands with an old shop rag, "I appreciate you stopping by, but that barn's been grandfathered since before your development was even a wet dream in some contractor's mind." Her smile tightened like a noose. Mr. Brennan, property values in our community depend on maintaining certain aesthetic standards. That eyesore is visible from 17 homes, and frankly, it's destroying everyone's investment. The diesel settled into its steady heartbeat behind us, and I could taste that hint of autumn in the air that meant harvest season was coming. I understand your concern, I replied, but this is private agricultural property. Your HOA has exactly zero jurisdiction here. That's when her mask didn't just slip. It vaporized. Her eyes went dead as a shark's, and her voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any federal sentencing I'd ever handed down. Mr. Brennan, there are many creative solutions to problems that affect our community's prosperity. I do hope you won't force us to explore them. The way she said creative solutions made my old prosecutor instincts start screaming. Brenda's first creative solution arrived exactly 1 week later in the form of Dale Hoffman, Millfield County's code enforcement officer. Dale showed up on a Thursday morning driving a county pickup that looked like it had survived the apocalypse, clutching a clipboard thick enough to stop bullets. "Mr. Brennan?" Dale's voice cracked like a teenager asking for a prom date. "I've got some, complaints here about potential code violations on your property." I set down my coffee mug, the one that said, "I survived 27 years of federal court and all I got was this lousy retirement," and walked over to where Dale stood shifting his weight like he desperately needed a bathroom. The morning air carried that sharp October bite mixed with the nervous sweat rolling off him in waves. Poor bastard looked like he was attending his own execution. "What kind of violations, Dale?" He flipped through papers with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "Well, there's been anonymous complaints about noise ordinances, dust control, potential rodent harboring, improper storage of agricultural equipment, septic system concerns, environmental hazards." His voice got smaller with each item. I'd seen enough terrified witnesses to recognize when someone was being squeezed. "Dale, how many complaints came in this week?" 14. The word fell out like a death sentence. 14 anonymous complaints in 1 week about a farm that's been minding its own business since Eisenhower was president. Dale's Adam's apple did a tap dance. "Look, Judge, sorry, Mr. Brennan, I know this stinks worse than a pig farm in August, but I've got twin daughters starting college next year, and certain people with influence over county contracts have made it crystal clear that thorough enforcement in this area would be career-enhancing." The way he emphasized thorough enforcement told me everything I needed to know. "Who's applying this pressure, Dale?" He glanced around like snipers might be hiding in my corn stalks, then pulled out his phone. "She's not even trying to hide it anymore." The screen showed a voicemail transcript. "Dale, this is Brenda Kilpatrick. The Brennan situation requires immediate and comprehensive attention. I trust you understand the importance of maintaining community standards. Randy's company has several county projects coming up for bid, and we value working with cooperative officials." Holy shit. She just handed me a smoking gun with her fingerprints all over it. My old prosecutor brain fired up like a cold engine hitting premium gas. 27 years of dismantling corruption networks had taught me to recognize a pattern, and this had all the subtle elegance of a mob shakedown. "Dale, quick legal education. You familiar with Iowa's Right to Farm Act?" He shook his head like a confused golden retriever. "Iowa Code. Chapter 352 protects agricultural operations established before surrounding development. It specifically prohibits local governments from using nuisance ordinances to harass pre-existing farms." I gestured at my barn, which was literally older than both of us combined. "Every single complaint you just listed falls under nuisance ordinances. Right-to-farm laws in most states create an absolute shield against harassment complaints targeting agricultural operations that predate surrounding development. If your farm or rural property existed before nearby subdivisions, research your state's agricultural protection laws. They're often ironclad." Dale's face went whiter than fresh snow. "Are you telling me these complaints are illegal?" "I'm telling you that whoever's coaching you either doesn't understand agricultural law or they're gambling that you don't." I started photographing his clipboard with my phone. "Mind if I document this educational opportunity?" "Jesus, Judge, if Brenda finds out I let you—" "Dale." My courtroom voice could have stopped a charging bull. "I'm not your problem here. but someone is using county resources to conduct a personal vendetta against protected agricultural property, and that makes you an unwitting accomplice to official misconduct. The poor guy looked like someone had just told him his lottery ticket was a fake. What the hell am I supposed to do? Simple. Do your job honestly. File your report noting that all complaints involve activities specifically protected under Iowa agricultural exemptions. Take photographs documenting normal farm operations. Follow the law instead of following orders. Dale spent the next 30 minutes photographing my completely ordinary barn, tractor, and equipment. The morning sun made everything look like a postcard from America's agricultural heartland, which is exactly what it was. But while Dale documented my boring farm equipment, I was building a federal case. Every harassment visit, every abuse of county resources, every attempt to weaponize local government for personal gain, it was all going into a file that was getting fatter by the day. That evening, my phone rang at exactly 8:47 p.m. Some people are predictably punctual, even in their threats. Mr. Brennan? Brenda's voice could have flash-frozen hell. I understand you've been interfering with legitimate community enforcement activities. The woman had balls the size of Iowa, I'll give her that. Ms. Kilpatrick, I've simply documented your systematic abuse of county resources for personal harassment. Personal harassment? Her laugh could have shattered glass. Mr. Brennan, you're clearly struggling to understand how civilized communities function. People who insist on being difficult neighbors often discover that their problems tend to multiply exponentially. And there it was. Another threat delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for abuse of power. Ms. Kilpatrick, I replied, letting 3 decades of judicial authority leak into my voice. I think you're about to learn that some people's problems have a way of becoming everyone else's solutions. The silence that followed was so cold I could practically hear her brain calculating whether she'd just bitten off more than she could chew. Brenda's second wave of creativity arrived 10 days later in the form of legal papers served by a process server who looked like he'd rather be delivering anthrax. The lawsuit, filed in Millfield County District Court, demanded immediate demolition of my structurally dangerous agricultural facility and $50,000 in damages for diminished property values and severe emotional distress. I sat in my kitchen reading this legal fiction while my morning coffee went cold, and the sheer audacity made me laugh until my ribs hurt. After 27 years of seeing frivolous lawsuits, this one was a goddamn masterpiece. Brenda's lawyers claimed my 70-year-old barn posed an imminent threat to community welfare and was attracting vermin vagrant activity and potential terrorist concealment opportunities. Terrorist concealment opportunities. In a corn barn. In Iowa. The letterhead told the real story. Hawthorne, Sterling and Associates, a Des Moines firm that charged $800 an hour to help developers steamroll rural communities. This wasn't some local attorney grabbing quick cash. This was big league legal firepower that cost more per day than most people's annual salary. Someone was betting the farm to get rid of my barn, literally. I started digging into county property records, and what I found made my blood pressure spike. Over the past 18 months, 3 different shell companies had quietly purchased every piece of agricultural land within 2 miles of Millfield Estates. The purchasing agent listed on every single deed? Kilpatrick Development Solutions, LLC. The registered address? Randy's construction company office. They weren't eliminating an eyesore. They were assembling a 1,000-acre development empire, and my 47 acres sat right in the middle like a stubborn splinter. Time to call in some federal-grade legal backup. My old law clerk, Michael Chen, had gone on to become Chicago's most feared civil rights attorney, the kind of guy who made corrupt officials wake up in cold sweats. Judge Brennan! Please tell me you're calling because someone's stupid enough to violate your constitutional rights. Michael, someone's using county government to steal my land, and they just filed a lawsuit so ridiculous it belongs in a legal comedy show. Within 72 hours, Michael had filed a motion to dismiss for lack of standing, plus a federal countersuit under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 that would make Brenda's legal team soil their expensive suits. Section 1983 strips government immunity from officials who violate constitutional rights under color of law, making them personally liable for damages including attorney fees. When local officials abuse their power for personal profit, they can be sued as individuals and forced to pay damages from their own pockets. But the real fireworks started when Agent Sarah Kowalski called me back. I was replacing spark plugs in the John Deere when my phone rang, and the sound of her voice over my workshop speakers mixed with the metallic clink of tools and the faint scent of motor oil. Judge, that HOA situation you mentioned, it just became a federal priority. We've been tracking a systematic land fraud operation across 6 Iowa counties. Rural property owners getting harassed into distress sales, usually to shell companies connected to local officials. Let me guess, I said, wiping grease off my hands with a shop rag that had seen better decades. The targets are elderly farmers, veterans, and minorities? Bullseye. And the harassment pattern is identical every time. Anonymous complaints, frivolous violations, expensive legal warfare designed to force quick sales. Your Brenda Kilpatrick just earned herself a federal investigation file. The autumn air suddenly tasted like victory. Brenda thought she was playing small-town politics, but she'd actually tap-danced into a federal fraud case. That afternoon, I took a reconnaissance drive through Millfield Estates to see what $50 million of suburban conformity looked like. The development was a monument to creative bankruptcy. 847 houses that looked like they'd been extruded from the same architectural Play-Doh machine, each sitting on its regulation quarter-acre with lawns trimmed to HOA-approved specifications. I parked my beat-up pickup, complete with faded Vietnam veteran bumper sticker and rust spots that gave it character, right in front of Brenda's house, and took a nice, leisurely survey of her domain. I was admiring her psychotically perfect landscaping when a neighbor approached like he was sneaking through a minefield. 30s, pushing a stroller with one hand and gripping a coffee cup with the other like it contained liquid courage. "You're the judge with the barn, right?" He glanced around like Brenda might repel from the rooftops. "I'm Marcus Rodriguez. I wanted to thank you for fighting back. That woman's been turning our lives into a bureaucratic nightmare for 2 years." "What kind of nightmare, Marcus?" $80 fines for leaving our basketball hoop up past sunset. Violation notices for parking our work truck in our own driveway. Apparently it compromises neighborhood aesthetics. She tried to fine us $400 because our daughter drew hopscotch squares on the sidewalk with washable chalk. The exhaustion in his voice was palpable, like someone who'd been ground down by years of petty tyranny. "Have you documented these violations?" Marcus let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Judge, I've got enough of her violation notices to insulate my attic. My wife says we should frame them and call it modern art. The systematic destruction of the American dream." I handed him my card. "Marcus, would you testify about discriminatory enforcement in federal court?" His face lit up like I'd just offered him a lottery ticket. "Judge, I'd crawl through broken glass to testify against that woman. Half this neighborhood would throw a parade if someone finally took her down." As I drove home, I spotted Brenda watching from her picture window, her silhouette perfectly framed by custom shutters that probably cost more than most people's cars. She thought she was gathering intelligence on her enemy. What she was actually doing was watching a federal judge document her crimes in real time. Brenda's third act of creativity came in the form of good old-fashioned sabotage. It started with my electricity going out at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night. Not unusual for rural Iowa, except it happened again Thursday, then Saturday, then every few days after that. The power company kept apologizing for equipment failures and routine maintenance, but somehow these failures only affected my property. Then my water pressure dropped to a trickle. The county claimed there were infrastructure issues in my area, but Marcus Rodriguez called to let me know his water was flowing just fine. Thank you very much. But Brenda's masterstroke was the anonymous letter to the editor of the Millfield Gazette published on a Wednesday morning while I was trying to coax my generator back to life. The letter, signed only as a concerned neighbor, painted me as a dangerous recluse who was stockpiling suspicious materials in my barn and exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior toward community members. The smell of diesel exhaust from my backup generator mixed with the crisp November air as I read this creative fiction over my morning coffee. Apparently, I was now a potential domestic terrorist because I owned farm equipment and had the audacity to tell an HOA president to go pound sand. That same afternoon, while I was checking my security cameras, I spotted something interesting in the footage from the night my power went out. At 2:14 a.m., 3 minutes before the outage, a white Mercedes had driven slowly past my property line. The license plate was crystal clear in my infrared camera, HOAREEN1, Brenda's vanity plate. She'd been scouting my property in the middle of the night, probably looking for the perfect sabotage opportunity. But if Brenda thought a few power outages and some small-town gossip would break me, she clearly hadn't done her homework on federal judges. We don't break, we build cases. I called Agent Kowalski with an update on my domestic terrorism allegations. Sarah, our HOA queen just escalated to infrastructure sabotage and character assassination. I've got video evidence of surveillance, documented utility tampering, and now she's trying to paint me as a security threat. Perfect, Sarah said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Judge, what I'm about to tell you is going to make your day. We just got approval for electronic surveillance on the Kilpatrick organization. Turns out your little barn burning is connected to a multi-county conspiracy involving municipal officials, development companies, and systematic civil rights violations. The pieces were falling into place like a well-constructed prosecution case. While Brenda was playing amateur hour sabotage games, the FBI was building a federal racketeering case that would put her away for decades. That evening, my phone started ringing with calls from neighbors I'd never met. Word was spreading through Millfield Estates that the old judge was fighting back and people were coming out of the woodwork with their own Brenda horror stories. Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow from Maple Lane, called to tell me about the time Brenda fined her $200 for hanging laundry outside. Apparently, clotheslines were inconsistent with community standards, even though they weren't mentioned anywhere in the HOA rules. Tom Patterson, a veteran from Oak Street, got hit with violation notices every time he parked his motorcycle in his own driveway. Brenda claimed it was commercial equipment, even though Tom used it to commute to his job at the VA hospital. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Brenda targeted anyone who couldn't afford to fight back. Elderly residents on fixed incomes, working families with kids, veterans trying to rebuild their lives, anyone who looked like an easy mark for her power games. My favorite call came from Jennifer Walsh, a single mom who got fined for having a non-regulation garden gnome in her front yard. When she asked which regulation it violated, Brenda told her that garden gnomes attracted the wrong element to the neighborhood. Jennifer asked if that meant the gnomes or the people who liked them, and Brenda's response was apparently unprintable in polite company. But the most disturbing call came from Marcus Rodriguez. Judge, I need to tell you something. Brenda approached my wife at the grocery store yesterday. She told Maria that it would be unfortunate if my immigration status came under federal scrutiny. My blood pressure spiked. Marcus, are you a naturalized citizen? 20 years ago, Judge. I've got the certificate framed in my living room. But Brenda doesn't know that, and she's betting I'm too scared to find out what kind of trouble she can cause. That threat crossed a line from harassment into something much more serious. Threatening to weaponize federal immigration enforcement against a U.S. citizen for personal revenge wasn't just abuse of power, it was a federal crime in itself. I spent that evening documenting every call, every story, every pattern of discriminatory enforcement that Brenda had used to terrorize her own neighbors. The filing cabinet in my den was starting to look like the evidence room from a major racketeering case, which, as it turned out, was exactly what it was becoming. At 3:17 a.m., I was jolted awake by the smell of smoke. I looked out my bedroom window to see an orange glow where my grandfather's barn used to stand. The structure that had weathered 70 Iowa winters, that had sheltered 3 generations of corn harvests, that had survived the Dust Bowl and the farm crisis of the 1980s, was burning like a Viking funeral pyre. I stood there in my pajamas, watching 70 years of family history turn to ash and char, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since my first day on the federal bench. The cold, focused fury that comes right before you destroy someone's entire world. Brenda Kilpatrick had just made the biggest mistake of her life. While the fire department was still hosing down the smoldering remains of my grandfather's barn, I was already making phone calls. The first went to Agent Kowalski, who answered on the second ring despite it being 4:23 a.m. Federal arson of a veteran's heritage property, I told her, my voice steady despite the rage coursing through my veins. I've got security footage, I've got motive, and I've got enough evidence of conspiracy to put this entire operation away for life. Judge, I'm driving to you right now. Don't touch anything, don't talk to anyone except federal agents, and for God's sake, don't do anything that might compromise the prosecution. The second call went to Michael Chen. Michael, they just burned down my grandfather's barn. I want to file a federal civil rights lawsuit so comprehensive it bankrupts everyone involved down to their grandchildren. But it was my third call that would change everything. I dialed my old colleague, Federal Judge Patricia Morrison, who'd been handling property law cases for 30 years. Patty, I need you to walk me through something about agricultural exemptions and HOA authority. If someone wanted to force the sale of grandfathered agricultural property, what would be the legal mechanism? Thad, the only way to break agricultural exemptions is to prove the property is no longer being used for agricultural purposes, or to demonstrate that the exemption was fraudulently obtained. Why are you asking? That's when it hit me like a sledgehammer to the skull. I'd been looking at this all wrong. I grabbed my laptop and started pulling county records, digging deeper than I ever had before. What I found in the original HOA incorporation documents made my hands shake with fury. The bombshell. The Millfield Estates HOA wasn't just a homeowners association. Buried in Section 47C of the incorporation papers was a clause that gave the HOA first right of refusal on any non-conforming properties within a 2-mile radius, at 60% of assessed market value. Every harassment campaign, every bogus violation, every attempt to force me off my land wasn't random cruelty. It was a systematic plan to make my life so miserable that I'd sell my property for pennies on the dollar directly to Brenda's HOA. But the real kicker was in the financial disclosures I found buried in the county clerk's office. Brenda Kilpatrick personally owned $2.3 million in stock in Heartland Development Corporation, the same company that held the purchase options on my land and every other agricultural property they'd been targeting. She wasn't just an HOA president drunk on power. She was a criminal running a multi-million-dollar land fraud operation. Many HOA incorporation documents contain hidden clauses about property acquisition rights that most homeowners never read, giving HOA boards legal mechanisms to acquire surrounding properties at below-market prices. Always read the complete HOA covenants before buying in a development. These documents can contain shocking property acquisition powers. The financial web went deeper than I'd imagined. Randy's construction company had been awarded 847 building permits for Millfield Estates, plus contracts for every road, every utility line, every piece of infrastructure in the development. The total value exceeded $50 million, all of it flowing through companies that Brenda either owned or controlled. My 47 acres wasn't just an eyesore to her. It was the final piece in a development empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. With my property, they could build another 200 luxury homes, a shopping center, maybe even a golf course. No wonder she was willing to commit federal arson to get rid of me. I spent the rest of the morning documenting everything, building a financial conspiracy case that would make the Watergate prosecutors jealous. By the time Agent Kowalski arrived at 7:15 a.m., I had enough evidence to prove that Brenda Kilpatrick was running the most sophisticated rural land fraud operation in Iowa history. Agent Kowalski, I said, handing her a thick folder as we stood in the ashes of my grandfather's barn, I believe we need to discuss RICO charges. The smell of charred oak mixed with the morning air, and for the first time since this whole mess started, I smiled. Brenda thought burning down my barn would break my spirit. What she'd actually done was hand me the key to her entire criminal empire. By 8 a.m., my dining room had been transformed into a federal war room. Agent Kowalski arrived with 2 other FBI agents and enough evidence boxes to stock a small library. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the lingering scent of burned wood drifting through my windows. A perfect reminder of what we were fighting for. Judge Brennan, Agent Kowalski said, spreading files across my grandmother's oak table, what you've uncovered connects to our broader investigation in ways that are frankly stunning. Brenda Kilpatrick isn't just running a local scam. She's the Iowa hub of a multi-state land fraud network. Agent Rodriguez, a sharp-eyed investigator from the Des Moines field office, pulled out a tablet showing financial flowcharts that looked like a spiderweb designed by a paranoid mathematician. We've traced similar operations in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. The pattern is identical. HOA harassment, municipal corruption, forced property sales, massive development profits. The third agent, Thompson, was already setting up surveillance equipment. Judge, we'd like your permission to wire your property. When Brenda makes her next move, and she will, we want every word recorded in federal court quality. While the FBI turned my farm into a surveillance station, I was building the legal strategy that would destroy Brenda's empire. Michael Chen drove down from Chicago with a legal team that looked like they could prosecute war crimes, and my old clerk Sarah Martinez flew in from Denver with her expertise in municipal corruption cases. "Thad," Michael said, reviewing my evidence files. "This is the most comprehensive civil rights violation case I've seen in 15 years. We're talking about systematic targeting of protected classes, abuse of government resources, conspiracy to commit fraud. This is a prosecutor's dream." Under federal RICO statutes, a pattern of criminal activity conducted through an organization can result in asset forfeiture of the entire enterprise, plus triple damages for victims. When criminals use legitimate businesses to conduct illegal schemes, federal prosecutors can seize everything: bank accounts, properties, even personal assets. The community mobilization was happening faster than I'd expected. Marcus Rodriguez had organized a secret meeting in the basement of St. Mary's Catholic Church, and by Thursday evening, 47 Millfield Estates residents had shown up with documentation of Brenda's harassment campaigns. Mrs. Chen brought a shoebox full of violation notices, each one more ridiculous than the last. Tom Patterson had photographs of Brenda's people measuring his grass with rulers to find violations. Jennifer Walsh had recorded phone calls where Brenda threatened to have her children removed by social services for inadequate yard maintenance. "Judge," Marcus said, standing in front of the assembled group, "we've all been living in fear for years. Some of us were afraid to hang our flag outside on Veterans Day because Brenda said patriotic displays were politically divisive. She made us feel like prisoners in our own homes. The documentation project revealed the true scope of Brenda's operation. Over 3 years, she'd issued 1,247 violation notices to 187 different families. The average fine was $312, but the psychological damage was immeasurable. People were selling their homes and moving away rather than deal with her constant harassment. My favorite piece of evidence came from Bob Hendricks, a retired postal worker who'd been fined for having a non-regulation American flag in his front yard. When he asked Brenda which regulation prohibited the flag, she told him that flags needed to be proportionally appropriate to the residential aesthetic. Bob's response was to install a 30-foot flagpole in his backyard and fly a flag the size of a bedsheet, which technically wasn't in his front yard, and therefore didn't violate her made-up rule. While the FBI was building their criminal case and Michael was preparing our civil lawsuit, I was working on the piece de resistance, a comprehensive federal complaint that would expose the entire corruption network to public scrutiny. Tom Brennan, no relation despite the name, ran the Millfield Gazette and jumped at the chance to cover the biggest story in the county's history. "Judge, this is Pulitzer Prize material. A federal judge taking down municipal corruption in his own backyard. This is going national. The media strategy was crucial. We needed public attention to prevent Brenda from destroying evidence or intimidating witnesses." Tom coordinated with the Des Moines Register, and by Friday afternoon, reporters from 3 major newspapers were calling for interviews. Agent Kowalski brought in technical specialists to analyze the security footage from my barn fire. The results were damning. They'd identified 3 separate vehicles in the area between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., including Brenda's Mercedes and 2 trucks registered to Randy's construction company. "Judge," she said, showing me the enhanced footage on her laptop, "we've got them dead to rights. Vehicle identification, cell phone tower pings, even chemical residue analysis that confirms accelerant use. This isn't just arson, it's a federal terrorism charge waiting to happen." By Sunday evening, our legal and investigative team had assembled enough evidence to take down a small government. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We'd use the monthly HOA meeting to publicly expose Brenda's crimes, with federal agents positioned to make arrests and media present to document everything. "Brenda thinks she's been playing chess," I told the assembled team as we reviewed our final strategy. "What she doesn't realize is that we've been playing federal prosecution this whole time, and she just walked into checkmate." The sound of my grandfather's wind chimes on the front porch mixed with the autumn evening air, and I could almost feel Seamus nodding his approval. This wasn't just about justice for my barn anymore. This was about saving an entire community from a predator who'd been feeding on their fear for years. Brenda's desperation revealed itself 3 days before the monthly HOA meeting, and it came wrapped in a package so audacious I almost admired her brass. She showed up at my front door at exactly 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by County Commissioner Dale Fitzpatrick, a man whose belly strained against his suit like a sausage about to burst its casing. "Mr. Brennan," Brenda said, her voice dripping with fake concern, "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Dale and I would like to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to our community situation. I invited them into my kitchen, where the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the lingering scent of charred wood drifting through the windows. What I didn't tell them was that Agent Kowalski's surveillance team had wired my entire house, and every word they spoke was being recorded in crystal-clear digital quality. Commissioner Fitzpatrick settled his bulk into my grandfather's chair and got straight to business. "Judge, we understand you've suffered some property damage recently. The county would like to make this right." Brenda opened her briefcase with the precision of a surgeon, pulling out documents that made my eyebrows raise. "Mr. Brennan, I'm prepared to offer you $400,000 for your property. Cash, 30-day closing, no inspections or contingencies. $400,000 for land worth at least $1.2 million. They weren't even trying to hide the fact that this was a shakedown." "That's very generous," I said, keeping my voice neutral while my phone app recorded every word. "But I'm not looking to sell." Commissioner Fitzpatrick leaned forward, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a confidential whisper. "Judge, between you and me, there might be some administrative complications if this property dispute continues. Tax assessments, environmental inspections, infrastructure requirements, these things can get expensive fast." Brenda nodded sympathetically. "What Dale is saying is that we have the ability to make your legal problems disappear. That federal lawsuit, the insurance claims from the fire, all of that could be resolved very quietly if we can reach an understanding." Holy shit. They were offering to obstruct federal justice in exchange for my land. "And if I don't accept this generous offer?" I asked, pouring myself more coffee with hands that stayed perfectly steady despite my racing pulse. Fitzpatrick's smile had all the warmth of a January blizzard. "Well, Judge, county government has many tools at its disposal. Building inspections, septic assessments, tax audits. These processes can be very thorough when public safety is at stake." I let them talk for another 20 minutes, documenting every threat, every bribe attempt, every abuse of official power. They laid out their entire corruption network like a PowerPoint presentation, complete with details about which county officials were cooperative and which federal investigators might be redirected with the right political pressure. The best part was when Brenda explained that my attitude problem was affecting property values throughout the county, and that selling to them would be my patriotic duty to support economic development. Apparently, letting corrupt officials steal your family land was now a form of civic service. After they left, I called Agent Kowalski immediately. "Sarah, I just recorded a sitting county commissioner offering to obstruct federal justice and a HOA president attempting to bribe a federal witness. Please tell me you got all of that." "Every beautiful word, Judge. We've got enough evidence to charge them with conspiracy, bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of office. Your little coffee meeting just became the centerpiece of our federal case." But Brenda wasn't done with her desperate measures. That afternoon, Marcus Rodriguez called with panic in his voice. "Judge, they're escalating. Brenda just had my wife fired from her job at the county hospital. They claimed budget cuts, but Maria was the only one terminated, and she'd just gotten a performance bonus last month. The attacks on my supporters were systematic and vicious. Mrs. Chen received a notice that her property taxes were being reassessed for potential overvaluation. Tom Patterson got hit with a county citation claiming his motorcycle violated noise ordinances, even though he hadn't started it in 3 days. Jennifer Walsh called to report that social services had shown up at her house for an anonymous tip about child welfare concerns. The investigator apologized profusely when he saw her pristine home and well-cared-for children, admitting that the complaint had been suspiciously vague and probably malicious. Federal witness intimidation laws carry severe penalties, up to 20 years in prison for threatening or retaliating against someone cooperating with federal investigators. If you're helping with a federal investigation and face retaliation, document everything and report it immediately. Witness intimidation charges often carry longer sentences than the original crimes. That evening, my phone rang with calls from reporters. Someone had leaked information about the federal investigation to the media, and suddenly my little HOA dispute was front-page news across Iowa. "Judge Brennan," said Katie Morrison from Channel 7 News, "can you confirm that you're cooperating with a federal investigation into municipal corruption in Millfield County?" The leak wasn't accidental. Brenda was trying to control the narrative, painting herself as a victim of federal overreach, and me as a vindictive ex-judge using my connections to harass honest community leaders. But her media strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of sympathy, she generated intense public scrutiny of her financial dealings and political connections. By Thursday morning, 3 more news outlets were investigating HOA abuse patterns across Iowa, and the state attorney general's office had announced its own inquiry into municipal corruption. Brenda had tried to bury me with threats and bribes. Instead, she'd created a media firestorm that would expose her crimes to the entire state. The woman was digging her own grave with a federal-sized shovel. Brenda's final act of desperation came in the form of a public relations blitz that would have made Joseph Goebbels proud. She hired Meridian Crisis Management, a Chicago firm that specialized in rehabilitating the reputations of disgraced politicians and corporate executives. Within 48 hours, Millfield County was flooded with a narrative that painted me as an unstable has-been abusing federal connections to terrorize honest community leaders. The campaign was sophisticated and vicious. Anonymous social media accounts sprouted like weeds, spreading rumors that I'd been forced into early retirement due to cognitive decline and judicial misconduct. Local Facebook groups were suddenly filled with posts questioning my mental stability and suggesting that my obsession with the HOA was evidence of paranoid delusions. The most damaging attack came in the form of a leaked audio recording, supposedly from a closed judicial conference, where someone with a voice remarkably similar to mine discussed letting dangerous criminals walk free due to procedural technicalities. The recording was expertly doctored, mixing real audio from my federal sentencing hearings with fabricated statements designed to destroy my credibility. But Brenda made a critical error. She underestimated how much federal agents hate being lied to. Agent Kowalski called me at 6:23 a.m., her voice tight with controlled fury. "Judge, that audio recording is fake as a $3 bill. Our technical analysis shows at least 17 different splice points, and the voice pattern analysis doesn't match your speech rhythms. Whoever made this is looking at federal charges for fabricating evidence in a criminal investigation." The FBI's response was swift and devastating. Within hours, they'd traced the recording to a digital media company in Des Moines that specialized in reputation management for political campaigns. The company's client list read like a who's who of corrupt officials across the Midwest, and their payment records showed a direct wire transfer from Kilpatrick Development Solutions. While Brenda was busy destroying her own credibility with fake evidence, I was documenting the systematic retaliation against anyone who dared to support me. The harassment campaign had reached truly vindictive levels. Marcus Rodriguez's immigration status was suddenly under review by federal authorities. Except the investigation request had come from County Commissioner Fitzpatrick, not from any legitimate federal agency. When IC agents showed up at Marcus's door, they were genuinely confused to discover he'd been a naturalized citizen for 20 years. Mrs. Chen received a property condemnation notice claiming her 70-year-old house was structurally unsound and required immediate evacuation. The county inspector who signed the notice later admitted privately that he'd never actually visited her property. He'd just been told to find problems with anyone supporting the troublesome judge. Tom Patterson got arrested for public intoxication while stone-cold sober in his own driveway. The arresting officer, Deputy Kevin Walsh, later told his sergeant that he'd been ordered to find a reason to arrest Patterson, even though the veteran hadn't had a drink in 15 years. My personal favorite was when they tried to have me arrested for agricultural terrorism because I was allegedly harboring dangerous livestock in my non-existent barn. The county animal control officer showed up with a warrant to seize my militant poultry, only to discover that I didn't own any chickens, militant or otherwise. When he asked who'd filed the complaint, his supervisor just shrugged and said it had come from reliable sources in the community. But the retaliation campaign created an unexpected consequence. It generated dozens of additional federal witnesses. Every abuse of power, every fraudulent government action, every attempt to weaponize county resources for personal revenge created new victims who were eager to testify. Federal conspiracy charges can be brought against anyone who participates in a criminal enterprise, even if they weren't involved in planning the original crimes. When public officials abuse their power to help criminal conspiracies, they become part of the conspiracy and face the same penalties as the masterminds. Agent Kowalski's investigation had expanded to include 12 county officials, 6 local business owners, and what appeared to be a sophisticated network of municipal corruption that extended across 3 congressional districts. The evidence was so overwhelming that federal prosecutors were considering RICO charges that could result in decades of prison time for everyone involved. The breaking point came when Brenda tried to have me committed for psychiatric evaluation. She filed paperwork claiming I was a danger to myself and others, citing my paranoid delusions about federal conspiracies and my increasingly erratic behavior toward community leaders. The petition was signed by Dr. Gerald Hoffman, Dale's brother as it turned out, who claimed to have observed my deteriorating mental state despite never having met me. The court order for involuntary commitment was signed by Judge Timothy Fitzpatrick, Commissioner Fitzpatrick's nephew. The family corruption network was so blatant it would have been funny if it wasn't so dangerous. When Deputy Walsh showed up at my door with commitment papers, he found Agent Kowalski's surveillance team documenting his every move. The deputy took one look at the federal agents and quietly explained that he was just following orders from his superiors. "Son," I told him, "you might want to start documenting those orders very carefully. The FBI tends to prosecute people who follow illegal commands." That evening, Agent Kowalski called with news that made my day. "Judge, we've got enough evidence to take down the entire corruption network. Grand jury indictments are being prepared for 14 defendants, including our friend Brenda. The U.S. attorney wants to coordinate arrests with maximum media coverage." "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow night, at the HOA meeting. We're going to end this publicly, with the whole community watching." The smell of autumn air drifted through my windows, carrying the promise of justice finally served. Brenda had spent months trying to destroy me with lies and intimidation. Tomorrow night, she was about to learn what happens when you attack a federal judge who spent 27 years perfecting the art of legal warfare. The Millfield Community Center had never seen a crowd like this. 437 people packed into a space designed for 200, with overflow crowds watching through windows and a live stream that was already being shared across social media. The air buzzed with anticipation, anxiety, and the metallic scent of too many people in too small a space. I arrived at exactly 7 p.m., carrying my grandfather's charred hammer in a clear evidence bag. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but sometimes the best justice is served without subtlety. Agent Kowalski and her team were positioned throughout the crowd, dressed as concerned residents but communicating through nearly invisible earpieces. Brenda called the meeting to order with the confidence of someone who still believes she controlled the narrative. She wore her most expensive suit, navy blue Armani that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, and her smile had been polished to courtroom perfection. "Before we begin tonight's agenda," she announced, her voice carrying that familiar edge of authority, "I want to address the recent harassment campaign being conducted against your elected HOA leadership by certain individuals who refuse to respect community standards." The crowd murmured, but not in the way she expected. People were exchanging glances, checking phones, whispering among themselves. Word of the federal investigation had leaked, and the community was primed for confrontation. "Mrs. Kilpatrick," I said, standing up in the back of the room, "I'd like to address the community about those harassment allegations." Her face went pale beneath her foundation, but she couldn't refuse without looking guilty. "Mr. Brennan, you'll have your turn during the public comment period." "Actually," Agent Kowalski said, rising from her seat near the front, "Mr. Brennan can speak now. FBI Special Agent Sarah Kowalski and this community meeting just became a federal evidence-gathering session." The room exploded into chaos. People pulling out phones, reporters rushing forward, Brenda's face cycling through expressions of shock, rage, and dawning terror. Commissioner Fitzpatrick, who'd been sitting in the front row like a loyal lapdog, tried to bolt for the exit but found his path blocked by Agent Rodriguez. I walked to the podium carrying my laptop in a folder thick enough to stop bullets. The crowd quieted as I set down my grandfather's hammer, the sound of charred wood hitting the podium echoing through the suddenly silent room. "My name is Federal Judge Thaddeus Brennan, retired. 3 months ago, Brenda Kilpatrick began a systematic campaign to force me off my family's land through harassment, intimidation, and eventually arson. What she didn't know was that she was documenting federal crimes every step of the way." I opened my laptop and projected financial records onto the community center's screen. Bank transfers, shell company documents, kickback payments, a financial spiderweb that connected Brenda to a multi-million-dollar land fraud operation spanning 6 counties. Over the past 18 months, Mrs. Kilpatrick and her associates have used county government resources to target elderly residents, veterans, and minority homeowners for systematic harassment. The goal was to force property sales at below-market prices to development companies she secretly owned. Federal RICO laws allow prosecutors to seize all assets connected to criminal enterprises, including personal property, bank accounts, and real estate holdings. When someone uses legitimate businesses to commit crimes, they risk losing everything they own to federal asset forfeiture. Brenda finally found her voice. This is outrageous. Mr. Brennan is a disturbed individual who's been stalking and harassing community leaders for months. These allegations are the delusions of someone who clearly needs psychiatric help. That's when I played the recording from her bribery attempt. Her own voice filled the community center, crystal clear and absolutely damning. We have the ability to make your legal problems disappear. That federal lawsuit, the insurance claims from the fire, all of that could be resolved very quietly if we can reach an understanding. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear people breathing. Mrs. Kilpatrick, I continued, you made one fundamental error. You assumed a retired federal judge wouldn't know how to build a criminal case. You were wrong. Agent Kowalski stepped forward, pulling handcuffs from her jacket. Brenda Kilpatrick, you're under arrest for conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, bribery, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under color of law. The crowd erupted as Brenda's carefully constructed world collapsed in real time. Cameras flashed, people cheered, and somewhere in the chaos I heard Mrs. Chen shouting, "Finally!" in a voice that carried 70 years of satisfaction. As Agent Kowalski read Brenda her rights, I leaned into the microphone one last time. Mrs. Kilpatrick, you once told me there were creative ways to solve community problems. Turns out you were right, though I don't think federal prison was quite what you had in mind. Commissioner Fitzpatrick tried to make a run for it, but Agent Thompson was waiting by the fire exit. Deputy Walsh, who'd apparently decided that following illegal orders wasn't worth 20 years in federal prison, was already providing testimony to Agent Rodriguez. The community center had become a crime scene, a news event, and a moment of collective catharsis all at once. As federal agents led Brenda away in handcuffs, the crowd began to cheer, not with malice, but with the pure relief of people who'd been living under a tyrant's thumb for years. Marcus Rodriguez stood up in the crowd, tears streaming down his face. Judge, you gave us our community back. The smell of autumn air drifted through the open doors, mixing with the scent of justice finally served. Brenda Kilpatrick's reign of terror was over, and Millfield Estates was finally free. 6 months later, I stood in the same spot where my grandfather's barn had burned, watching a crew of volunteers raise the frame for its replacement. The morning air carried the sweet scent of fresh-cut oak and the sound of hammers ringing against nails, the same sounds Seamus would have heard 70 years ago. Brenda Kilpatrick was serving 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to racketeering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The plea deal came after prosecutors threatened RICO charges that could have put her away for life. Her restitution payments, $2.1 million and counting, were funding community improvements across Millfield County. Commissioner Fitzpatrick got 8 years for his role in the conspiracy, while Deputy Walsh received probation in exchange for his cooperation. The entire Kilpatrick corruption network had collapsed like a house of cards, taking down 14 local officials and business owners who'd thought they were untouchable. The best part was watching Randy Kilpatrick's construction company get blacklisted from county contracts. The man who'd built his empire on corruption and kickbacks was reduced to bidding on garage repairs and sidewalk installations. Justice has a sense of irony that would make Shakespeare proud. The new HOA board, led by Marcus Rodriguez, had implemented radical reforms that became a model for associations across Iowa. Term limits, financial transparency, open meetings, and an independent ombudsman to investigate complaints. The reign of petty tyrants was over, replaced by actual democratic governance. Mrs. Chen had become the community's unofficial historian, documenting every abuse of power from the Kilpatrick era to ensure nothing like it could happen again. We were all so afraid, she told me during the barn raising. Afraid to hang our laundry, afraid to park our cars, afraid to live in our own homes. You gave us the courage to fight back. The rebuilt barn was more than just a replacement for what Brenda had destroyed. It was a symbol of community resilience. Local Amish craftsmen had volunteered their expertise, veterans groups had donated materials, and families throughout Millfield Estates had contributed labor. What had started as one man's fight for justice had become an entire community's declaration of independence. Federal civil rights lawsuits under Section 1983 allow victims of government abuse to recover attorney fees and punitive damages, often resulting in settlements worth millions of dollars. When public officials violate your constitutional rights, you can sue them personally and force them to pay damages from their own pockets. The legal clinic I'd established in the rebuilt barn was helping rural families across 6 counties fight HOA abuse and municipal corruption. We'd handled over 200 cases in our first year, with a success rate that made my old prosecution record look modest. Turns out there were a lot of Brendas out there, and they all shared the same weakness. They couldn't handle organized resistance. Agent Kowalski's task force had expanded their investigation into 12 states, uncovering a nationwide network of development fraud targeting rural communities. The Kilpatrick case had become a template for federal prosecutors, showing how local corruption could be dismantled with proper coordination between federal agents and determined victims. The annual Seamus Brennan Heritage Festival had become Millfield County's biggest celebration, bringing together thousands of people to honor agricultural history and community cooperation. Local farmers displayed antique equipment, families shared traditional foods, and children learned about the immigrant families who'd built Iowa's agricultural foundations. The festival's centerpiece was a scholarship program for agricultural students, funded by the proceeds from Brenda's asset forfeiture. Every year, we awarded 20 scholarships to kids who wanted to carry on the farming traditions that built America's heartland. As I watched the sun set behind the new barn, casting long shadows across fields that would soon be planted with corn, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's death: complete peace. The land that Seamus had claimed with his Purple Heart hands was safe for future generations. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom Morrison at the Millfield Gazette. "Judge, got a call about an HOA president in Cedar Rapids who's threatening to foreclose on a veteran's home for flying an American flag. Interested?" I smiled and typed back, "Send me the details." Some people never learn. The fight for justice never really ends. It just finds new battlefields. But now I had a community of allies, a barn full of legal resources, and the satisfaction of knowing that predators like Brenda Kilpatrick would think twice before targeting rural families. If you've got your own HOA nightmare story, share it in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else fight back, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about justice prevailing over corruption. Hit that notification bell, because next week I'm telling you about the small-town mayor who tried to steal a veteran's memorial, and how one determined Gold Star mother brought down his entire administration. Some battles are worth fighting, no matter how long they take.